What happens when a 20-year-old secret crashes into the most exclusive dining room in New York City? On one side of the table sits the Worthington family billionaire titan Richard, his elegant wife Eleanor, and their beloved son Ethan, celebrating his 22nd birthday. Their life is a portrait of perfect, untouchable wealth. But on the other side of the room, holding a tray with trembling hands, is a waitress named Amelia. She isn't there just to serve their champagne. She's there to shatter their reality with 3 words that will ignite a firestorm. I'm his mother. This isn't just a story about a long-lost son. It's a story of desperate love, devastating lies, and the explosive moment one woman risks everything to reclaim the truth. The air in New York was thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. Crystal glasses chimed like distant bells, and the low hum of polite conversation was a symphony of the city's elite. For Amelia Hayes, it was just another Tuesday night. Another night of balancing searingly hot plates on her forearm, of smiling at people who looked through her, of calculating whether the tips would cover next month's rent on her tiny Brooklyn apartment. For 5 years, she'd been a ghost in this world, silently serving the architects of the Manhattan skyline, the titans of Wall Street, and the doyens of Park Avenue. She was good at her job precisely because she was invisible. But tonight, invisibility was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the restaurant. Her eyes kept darting to Table 7, the prime alcove, with a panoramic view of Central Park. The Worthington family. She knew them, of course, not personally, but through the glossy pages of Forbes and Vanity Fair that customers sometimes left behind. Richard Worthington, a real estate magnate with a jawline as rigid as his skyscrapers. Eleanor Worthington, his wife, a woman sculpted from ice and diamonds, renowned for her charity galas and her withering stare. And between them, him, Ethan Worthington. Amelia felt the air leave her lungs, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She had seen his face 1,000 times, first in secret newspaper clippings she'd collected, then on the carefully curated public Instagram profile she checked obsessively. She knew he played lacrosse at Yale. She knew he spent his summers sailing off Martha's Vineyard. She knew he had a small crescent-shaped birthmark just behind his left ear, a secret she had traced with her fingertip in the dim, sterile light of a hospital room 22 years ago. He was celebrating his 22nd birthday. Her son. The lie had been a living thing inside her for 2 decades, a cancerous growth on her soul. She was 17 alone and terrified when she'd given birth. The people from the private adoption agency, so kind, so reassuring, had told her she was giving him a better life. They'd given her a folder thick with cash and a document to sign her hand shaking so badly she could barely form the letters of her name. They had promised her he would be loved. And he was. Looking at him now, laughing at something his father said, his eyes bright with the easy confidence of someone who had never known a day of want. She knew they hadn't lied about that. He was loved, but it was a love built on a foundation of pure deception. For years, she had told herself to stay away. What right did she have to detonate a bomb in the middle of his perfect life? She was a waitress, a nobody. But 2 months ago, a letter had arrived. Her own mother, estranged for years, had passed away. In a box of old belongings, Amelia found a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside it was a tiny, faded photograph of her barely 17 holding a newborn baby. On the back, her mother had scratched a date, August 26th, 2003. Ethan's birthday. It was the only photograph she had. The locket felt like a judgment in her palm, a call to arms. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Julian, brushed past her. Hayes Table 7 needs their champagne topped up. The 82 Dom Perignon. Don't spill a drop, it costs more than your car. Amelia nodded, her throat suddenly dry. This was it. The universe, in its cruel and ironic way, was handing her the moment. She grabbed the chilled bottle, the condensation cold against her feverish skin. Her reflection in the polished silver bucket was a pale, terrified stranger. "You can't do this!" A voice screamed in her head. "You will ruin him." But another voice, the one that whispered to her in the lonely hours before dawn, was stronger. "He deserves the truth, and you deserve to be seen." She walked towards Table 7. Each step felt like wading through cement. The world seemed to narrow until only the four of them existed. Richard Worthington was telling a boisterous story. Eleanor smiled, a tight, polished smile, her hand resting possessively on Ethan's arm. Ethan was looking at his mother, his expression one of pure adoration. The sight was a knife in Amelia's gut. That should be her. She reached the table, her hands trembling so violently she was afraid she would drop the bottle. "Excuse me," she murmured. Her voice was a croak. Richard paused his story, giving her a cursory glance. "Yes, just a top-up, thank you." Amelia's eyes were fixed on Ethan. He looked up at her, a polite, fleeting smile on his lips. And in that moment, seeing him up close, seeing the familiar curve of his brow, the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, her eyes, the carefully constructed dam inside her, broke. She ignored the champagne glasses. She placed the bottle on the table with a soft thud. "Mr. Worthington," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "Mrs. Worthington." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze locking onto Ethan's. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of polite confusion. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem?" Her tone was laced with ice. "I need to speak with you." Amelia said the words, tumbling out. It's about your son." A hush fell over the table. Richard's affable expression hardened. "If you have a complaint, take it to your manager. We are celebrating." "No, you don't understand." Amelia pleaded, her desperation making her reckless. She fumbled in her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the locket. "I'm not a waitress tonight. I'm here because of him." She looked directly at Ethan, her heart breaking and soaring all at once. The lie was a poison, and she had to let it out before it killed her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of 2 lost decades. "My name is Amelia Hayes." She took one final desperate breath and lit the match that would burn all their worlds to the ground. "I'm your real mother." The 4 words hung in the air, seemingly sucking all the sound from the opulent dining room. For a split second there was only a stunned, ringing silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion. Ethan's face was a mask of utter bewilderment, his eyes darting from Amelia's desperate, tear-streaked face to the glacial fury solidifying on Eleanor's. Richard Worthington looked as though he'd been physically struck, his mouth slightly agape. It was Eleanor who recovered first. Her reaction was instantaneous and brutal. A short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor, escaped her lips. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension, "it seems the staff here are more entertaining than the floor show. Julian," she raised her voice, snapping her fingers as if summoning a dog. "We have a deranged woman bothering us." Ethan didn't seem to hear her. He was still staring at Amelia, his head tilted. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet and confused. "What did you just say? She said she's your mother, darling?" Eleanor cut in her tone, mocking. "Clearly she's had a bit too much of the cooking sherry. She's probably hoping for a large settlement to keep her quiet. It's a classic pathetic little scam." "It's not a scam," Amelia cried out, her voice rising in panic. She couldn't let them dismiss her like this, not after coming so far. She pulled the locket from her pocket, the chain tangling in her trembling fingers. "I have proof. Please just look." She lunged forward, not to attack, but to show them holding the locket out over the table. The instinctive reaction was swift. Richard stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the marble floor. "That's enough security." But Ethan's eyes had fixated on the small silver object dangling from her hand. He didn't move. He just watched as she fumbled with the clasp and opened it. "This is me," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "And this is you. The day you were born." She thrust it towards him. For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. Then slowly, hesitantly, Ethan leaned forward. The photo was tiny and faded, the quality poor, but it was undeniably a young woman. A girl, really, with Amelia's wide, hazel eyes, cradling a swaddled infant. "Ethan, don't," Eleanor warned, her voice a low hiss. "It's a trick." But he couldn't look away. It was just a photo. It could be any baby. But the woman, she looked so young, so terrified, and so full of a fierce, protective love that it radiated even from the cheap-aged paper. Amelia saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, and a wild hope surged through her. "They told me you had a birthmark," she pressed on her words, frantic. "A small one, like a tiny crescent moon just here." She raised a hand and pointed to the spot behind her own left ear. "They let me hold you for 10 minutes. I remember counting your fingers and your toes. I remember you smelled like milk and promise." Ethan's hand instinctively went to the back of his own ear. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. It was an insignificant detail, one he rarely thought about. But it was there. He knew it was there. How could this stranger possibly know that the commotion had finally attracted the attention of the entire restaurant? Diners were turning in their seats, whispering behind their napkins. Julian, the manager, was rushing over his face, ashen. "Mrs. Worthington, I am so dreadfully sorry, Amelia. What in God's name are you doing?" Eleanor rose to her full, formidable height. Her face was a mask of cold rage, but a sliver of panic was visible in her eyes. "Get this trash out of my sight. She is fired. I will personally see to it that she never works in this city again." 2 burly security guards arrived flanking Julian. They moved towards Amelia, their expressions grim. "No, wait," Ethan said, suddenly standing up. "Just wait a second." All eyes turned to him. "How do you know about the birthmark?" he asked Amelia, his voice low and intense. Before Amelia could answer, Eleanor stepped between them, physically blocking his view of Amelia. "Ethan, darling, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself. She's a common grifter. She could have found that information anywhere. Public records, a disgruntled former staff member. These people are devious. What public record mentions a birthmark behind my ear? Mom?" Ethan shot back a note of uncharacteristic frustration in his voice. Richard finally spoke, his voice a low growl that commanded authority. "This is not the time or the place for this discussion. We are leaving." He threw a black credit card onto the table. "Julian, cover the bill and damages for the scene. Our apologies to your other guests." He grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Eleanor, now!" The security guards took Amelia's arms in a firm grip. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "Please," Amelia begged, trying to twist out of their grasp, her eyes locked on Ethan. "Don't let them do this. Just talk to me, please, Ethan." But the family unit was closing ranks. Richard was already steering a stony-faced Eleanor towards the exit. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. He looked from Amelia's pleading face to his parents' retreating backs, the weight of 22 years of love and loyalty to the woman he called mother, warred with the seed of doubt this stranger had just planted. "Dad, wait," he called out. But Richard didn't stop. The decision was made. With one last agonizing look at Amelia being dragged away, Ethan turned and followed his parents out of the restaurant, leaving Amelia alone in the wreckage of their perfect evening, her desperate cries echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. The ride back to the Worthingtons' palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse was a symphony of suffocating silence. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the Rolls-Royce, but inside the car the atmosphere was glacial. Richard stared straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather armrest. Ethan sat hunched in his seat, replaying the scene in his mind. The waitress's desperate eyes burned into his memory. And Eleanor was terrifyingly still, radiating a cold fury that was more menacing than any outburst. The moment the penthouse door closed behind them, the dam of civility burst. How could you let that happen? Eleanor whirled on Richard, her voice a venomous whisper. "You just stood there. You let that creature spew her filth all over my son's birthday dinner. What was I supposed to do, Eleanor?" Richard thundered, his composure finally cracking. "Tackle her to the ground myself. I handled it. It's over." "It is not over," she shrieked. "Don't you see what she's done?" She planted a seed in front of everyone. By morning, this will be all over page 6. Billionaire heir accosted by crazed waitress claiming to be his mother. Is that the headline you want? It will be a one-day story, a footnote. Richard dismissed, though a flicker of worry crossed his face. He began pacing the vast living room, the city glittering like a conquered kingdom below. "I'll have Richard Larson in legal draft, a cease and desist first thing in the morning. We'll get a restraining order. We'll ruin her." Ethan, who had been standing silently by the window, finally spoke. "How did she know about the birthmark?" His question dropped into the room like a stone. Both his parents stopped and looked at him. Eleanor was the first to react, her strategy shifting from fury to concerned maternalism in a heartbeat. She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering over his arms. "Oh, darling, you can't possibly be taking her seriously. Please." It was a lucky guess. Or more likely, she did some research. Perhaps she paid a nurse from the hospital all those years ago. People will do anything for money. "Who knew about it?" Ethan persisted, his voice steady. "Was it in my medical records? Did you ever tell anyone?" "Of course not," Eleanor said a little too quickly. "It was just a tiny little thing. I probably mentioned it to the nanny, Mrs. Gable, when you were a baby. She was fired years ago for stealing, you know. A disgruntled employee. That's probably it. She fed this waitress the information for a cut of the settlement." The explanation was plausible. It was neat. But it didn't feel right. There was a desperate, frantic energy coming off his mother that he'd never seen before. "I want to see my birth certificate," Ethan stated, his voice quiet but firm. "The original one." Richard stopped pacing. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You're letting a mentally unstable, gold-digging woman get into your head. Then it should be easy enough to prove her wrong, Ethan countered, looking his father dead in the eye. Get the birth certificate, the one from the hospital. Let me see it. A tense silence stretched between them. Eleanor's face tightened. Darling, all of that is in the safe deposit box at the bank. We can go on Monday. No, I want to see it now, Ethan insisted. You have a safe in your office, Dad. You keep important documents in there. I've seen you do it. Richard let out an exasperated sigh, but he saw the unyielding resolve in his son's eyes. This wasn't a request. To refuse would be to admit there was something to hide. Fine, he clipped. Fine. Let's put this nonsense to bed, so we can move on. He strode to his mahogany-paneled office, Ethan, and a visibly tense Eleanor following behind. He knelt before a large painting, swinging it aside to reveal a state-of-the-art digital safe. He pressed his thumb to the scanner and entered a code. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft hiss. Inside were stacks of files, deeds, and jewelry boxes. Richard rummaged for a moment before pulling out a thick, leather-bound portfolio labeled Ethan Personal. He placed it on his desk and opened it. He riffled through stock certificates and trust fund documents before pulling out a yellowed, official-looking paper, protected in a plastic sleeve. There, he said, sliding it across the polished desk to Ethan. The State of New York Hospital for Special Surgery, Certificate of Live Birth. For Ethan Charles Worthington, born to Eleanor and Richard Worthington. August 26, 2003. Happy. Ethan picked it up. It looked completely official. His parents' names were there in crisp, typewritten letters. The hospital, the date, the attending physician, Dr. Alan Sterling. It all seemed perfect. But as he scanned the document, a strange coldness washed over him. He wasn't a forensics expert, but something felt off. The paper felt too new, the ink too uniform. And in the space for the mother's signature, Eleanor's normally flawless looping cursive looked slightly cramped, almost hesitant. He looked up at his mother. This is it. From the day I was born. Of course it is. Eleanor said, her voice bright and brittle. I remember signing it like it was yesterday. I was so exhausted, but so happy. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ethan placed the certificate back on the desk. He felt a wave of guilt. He was doubting his own mother, the woman who had tucked him in at night, who had cheered the loudest at his lacrosse games, who had loved him unconditionally his entire life. The waitress was a stranger, a liar. She had to be. Okay, he said softly. I'm sorry. It's been a crazy night. Eleanor's relief was palpable. She rushed forward and hugged him tightly. It's all right, my love. It's forgotten. She was a nasty woman, and we will never see her again. I promise. Later that night, as Ethan lay in his bed, sleep wouldn't come. The waitress's Amelia's face haunted him. I remember you smelled like milk and promise. He thought about the birth certificate. He thought about his mother's strange, defensive reaction. He got out of bed and quietly made his way to the family library. On the shelves were dozens of ornately bound photo albums chronicling every year of his life. Ethan's first year, Ethan's first steps, Ethan's first Christmas. He pulled down the first one. He sat on the floor, flipping through the pages. There were hundreds of photos of him as a baby, in his father's arms, in his crib, in a stroller in Central Park. He was halfway through the album when a disturbing realization began to dawn on him. There were photos of Eleanor holding him, yes, but they all seemed to start when he was a week or two old. In all the photos from his first few days, the ones his dad had labeled the hospital, Eleanor was always sitting up in the bed, smiling while he was in a bassinet beside her, or in a nurse's arms, or his father's. There wasn't a single photograph of a postpartum Eleanor actually holding her newborn son in the hospital bed. And in every single shot of her, she was wearing a flowing silk bed jacket, not a hospital gown. She didn't look tired or recovering. She looked perfect, as if she were posing for a magazine shoot. He frantically pulled down another album and another. It was the same story. A perfectly curated image of motherhood, but with a strange, invisible barrier in those crucial first days. A cold dread, sharp and undeniable, began to creep up his spine. His mother's story. The neat explanations, the pristine birth certificate, it was all part of a fortress she had built. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Worthington began to wonder what terrible secret that fortress was designed to protect. The next 2 days were a blur of forced normalcy. Eleanor was relentlessly cheerful, planning outings and dinners, filling every moment with chatter, as if trying to plaster over the gaping hole Amelia had torn in their lives. Richard was buried in his work, speaking in clipped, efficient tones, the matter of the crazed waitress apparently dismissed. They were building the walls of their fortress higher, brick by brick. But for Ethan, the cracks were all he could see. The image of Amelia being dragged away, her eyes, pleading with him, was a constant looping horror in his mind. He found he couldn't look at his mother without a knot of suspicion tightening in his stomach. He feigned a headache to get out of a family dinner, and once alone in the penthouse did what he knew he had to do. He started with the restaurant Le Ciel Étoilé. He called and asked for Amelia Hayes. A cold professional voice informed him that no one by that name was employed there. She'd been erased. He then turned to the internet. Amelia Hayes was a common name, but he narrowed his search to New York City. He waded through dozens of profiles until he found one that matched. A sparse, private social media account. The profile picture was grainy, but it was her. Her listed place of work was her last job, a small diner in Queens. A thread of hope. He spent the rest of the night digging deeper. He searched for Dr. Alan Sterling, the physician listed on his birth certificate. Dr. Sterling had retired a decade ago, and according to an online obituary, had passed away from a heart attack 3 years later. A dead end. He searched for news articles about his own birth. There were a few society columns announcing the arrival of the Worthington heir, but they were vague, based on a press release from his father's company. No hospital photos. Nothing personal. It was all meticulously controlled. The next morning, he told his parents he was going to meet a friend from college. Instead, he took the subway to a part of Brooklyn he'd only ever seen from a distance. The address he'd found for Amelia led him to a modest pre-war walk-up, indistinguishable from the thousands around it. He stood on the pavement for a long time, his heart pounding. What was he doing here? What did he even want to ask? He was betraying his parents, chasing the fantasy of a lunatic. He almost turned back a dozen times, but the image of the photo albums of his mother's perfect unmaternal hospital poses pushed him forward. He buzzed apartment 3B. A moment later, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Hello." It was her. It's Ethan," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "Ethan Worthington." The silence on the other end was absolute. For a moment he thought she'd hung up. Then a loud buzz unlocked the front door. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hall. The door to 3B was already ajar. He pushed it open and found himself in a small, tidy but threadbare living room. It was the polar opposite of his own home, filled with mismatched furniture, second-hand books, and a surprising number of thriving plants. It felt lived in. It felt real. Amelia stood by the window, her back to him. She was wearing simple jeans and a faded t-shirt, a far cry from the starched Waitress uniform. She looked smaller, more vulnerable. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said without turning around. "I shouldn't be here." He admitted his voice, barely a whisper. She finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. There was no artifice, no performance, just a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Thank you," she said simply. Can I get you something?" "Water, I don't have much else." "No. Nothing, I need you to tell me everything," Ethan said, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "And it has to be the truth, because the woman I've called my mother my entire life is at home. And if you're lying, you're not just destroying her, you're destroying me." Amelia nodded slowly, gesturing to a worn armchair. He sat while she perched on the edge of her sofa. And then she began to speak. Her story was not a dramatic, tear-filled performance. It was a quiet, painful litany of facts. She spoke of growing up in a poor religious household in Pennsylvania, of falling in love with a boy who left for the army and never came back, of finding herself pregnant at 16 and utterly alone. She spoke of being sent to a home for unwed mothers, a place of shame and whispers. "That's where they found me," she said, her gaze distant. "A woman named Mrs. Peterson from the Seraphim Adoption Agency. She was so kind. She told me she represented a wealthy, childless couple who could give my baby the world. They would cover all my medical expenses, help me get back on my feet. All I had to do was sign the papers. I wasn't even 17. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't even know I was supposed to have one." She described being moved to a private clinic in upstate New York, a place of luxurious isolation. She never met the couple. She was told they wanted complete privacy. "When you were born," she continued, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "They let me hold you for 10 minutes. The nurse set a timer. 10 minutes. You were so small. You had so much dark hair. And I found that little mark behind your ear, and I kissed it. I thought it was a way of marking you as mine, so I'd never forget." She told him how they took him away, how Mrs. Peterson gave her an envelope with $10,000 in cash, a fortune to a terrified teenager, and a final paper to sign, an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. They put her on a bus back to Pennsylvania, and she never saw any of them again. The Seraphim Adoption Agency, she later discovered, had vanished. It had no records, no office. It had never really existed. "I tried to find you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "For years I looked, but I had no names, no information. It was a complete dead end. Then about 10 years ago, I saw an article in a magazine, a profile on Richard Worthington and his family. There was a picture of you about 12 years old on a sailboat, and I knew. I saw it in your eyes. I just knew it was you." She explained her years of watching from a distance, of being too ashamed and terrified of the Worthingtons' power to come forward. "What could I offer you?" she asked, her hands twisting in her lap. "This," she gestured around the tiny apartment. "I was a failure. You had everything. But living with the lie, it was eating me alive. That locket, finding it was a sign. I had to tell you. Even if you hated me, you had to know you weren't purchased. You were born, and you were loved." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the air thick with her words. The story was so detailed, so full of pain and raw honesty. It fit the pieces together in a way Eleanor's neat, angry denials never could. The private clinic explained the lack of hospital photos. The fake agency explained the secrecy. "My mother. Eleanor." He said the name feeling strange on his tongue. Why would she do this? She could have just adopted a child legally. Amelia looked at him with an expression of profound pity. "I don't know for sure, but men like your father, men like Richard Worthington, sometimes they need more than just a son. They need a bloodline, an heir. Maybe a legal adoption wasn't enough." The implication hung in the air, a lie not just to the world but to him, a lie perhaps even to his own father. Ethan stood up, his mind reeling. He looked at this woman, Amelia, this stranger who knew the most intimate secret of his existence. He saw the years of pain etched on her face, the quiet dignity in her poverty. "There was a nanny," he said, the memory of his mother's frantic explanation returning to him. "Mrs. Gable. Do you remember her?" Amelia's brow furrowed. "No, I never met any of the staff. They kept me completely isolated. My mother mentioned her." Ethan said a plan beginning to form in his chaotic thoughts. "She said she might have told her about the birthmark. She claimed she was fired for stealing." An idea cold and clear cut through his confusion. If his mother was telling the truth, Mrs. Gable would be a disgruntled ex-employee who could confirm her story. But if Amelia was telling the truth, Mrs. Gable would be the one person outside of his parents who was there at the very beginning. The one person who might have seen the cracks in the fortress walls. "I have to find her," Ethan said as much to himself as to Amelia. "I have to find Mrs. Gable." Finding Mrs. Gable was like searching for a ghost. Her name was Agnes Gable, and she had simply vanished from the Worthingtons' orbit 15 years ago. There was no forwarding address, no pension record. Richard's assistants could find Eleanor had handled her severance personally. For Eleanor, this was proof of the nanny's guilt and unreliability. For Ethan, it was another red flag. Amelia, however, proved to be a surprisingly resourceful ally. Having spent years learning how to find people with minimal information, she approached the problem with a quiet tenacity Ethan had never witnessed before. She spent hours in public libraries, scouring old databases and property records that weren't easily found online. It was Amelia who found the crucial breadcrumb, a church record from a small parish in Queens, listing an Agnes Gable as a volunteer soup kitchen coordinator. They drove there together in Ethan's Tesla, the sleek, silent car, feeling alien and ostentatious on the gritty city streets. The church was a humble brick building, and a kind-faced deacon pointed them towards a small, well-kept house 2 blocks away. Agnes Gable was now a woman in her late 70s, with kind eyes clouded by a deep-seated weariness. When she opened the door and saw Ethan, her hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment it looked as if she might faint. The resemblance to the young boy she had cared for was uncanny. She let them in her hands, trembling as she served them tea in mismatched cups. Her home was filled with religious icons and the scent of lavender. "I always prayed this day would come," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "And I always prayed it wouldn't." "Ethan." His heart pounding introduced Amelia. Mrs. Gable simply nodded her gaze, full of a sorrowful understanding. "I knew," she said softly. "I always knew she wasn't Mrs. Worthington's." The story she told them dismantled the last remaining pillars of Ethan's world. Mrs. Gable had been hired 3 months before Ethan's supposed birth. She was told Mrs. Worthington was on doctor-ordered bed rest for a difficult pregnancy and was not to be disturbed. She lived in a separate wing of the house. She saw Eleanor only occasionally and always from a distance. Eleanor would be swathed in luxurious robes, her belly seemingly large and round beneath the fabric. But there were strange things. Mrs. Gable recounted, her voice low. She never had a doctor visit the house, not once. All her appointments were off-site, and she never complained of kicking or morning sickness or any of the things a pregnant woman does. When I asked, she would just smile, that icy smile of hers, and say it was a blissfully easy pregnancy. The day Ethan arrived, everything was a blur of frantic, secretive activity. He wasn't brought home from the hospital by both parents in a grand affair. Instead, a black car with tinted windows pulled up to the service entrance late at night. A woman Mrs. Gable had never seen before, the mysterious Mrs. Peterson from the agency, carried him inside in a plain wicker basket and handed him directly to Eleanor, who was waiting in the nursery. Richard Worthington, she said, was conveniently away on an emergency business trip to Hong Kong. He wouldn't return for another week. By the time he came home, Mrs. Gable said, you were settled in the nursery, and Mrs. Worthington was playing the part of the adoring new mother perfectly. He never suspected a thing. But Mrs. Gable knew. A baby born of a mother who has been on bed rest for months is different from a baby born to an active woman. More importantly, she had been a maternity nurse for 20 years before becoming a nanny. She knew what a woman who has just given birth looks and feels like. Mrs. Worthington, she showed no signs of childbirth, Mrs. Gable stated plainly. None. No pain, no fatigue, no physical evidence whatsoever. When I tried to help her with things, she would wave me away. It was all a performance. A magnificent, terrifying performance. She worked for the Worthingtons for 7 years. She loved Ethan like her own grandson. But she lived in constant fear, knowing the terrible secret she was a part of. The end came abruptly. One afternoon, a small, invaluable Fabergé egg went missing from the library. Eleanor flew into a rage and accused Mrs. Gable of stealing it. She fired her on the spot, refusing to give her a reference and threatening her with prosecution if she ever spoke a word about the family to anyone. She gave me a check for $50,000, Mrs. Gable said, shamefaced. Hush money, and a document to sign. I was a widow with no savings. I was scared. So I took the money and I disappeared. The egg, of course, was found by a cleaner a week later, right where it had always been. Ethan felt sick. The calculated cruelty of it all was staggering. His entire childhood had been stage-managed by a master manipulator. So my father, Ethan began. He doesn't know. Mrs. Gable hesitated, twisting the fabric of her apron in her hands. That is the most terrible part of it all, child. I believe the lie is even deeper than you can imagine. She then delivered the final devastating blow. One night, very early on, I couldn't sleep. I was walking past Mr. Worthington's study, and I heard them arguing. The doors were thick, but Mrs. Worthington's voice was sharp. She was crying. I heard her say, "It was the only way. Richard, it was your only chance for a son. You know what Dr. Matthews said?" And then I heard him. He wasn't angry. He was broken. He said, "I know. God forgive me, I know. We will never speak of it again." Ethan and Amelia exchanged a look of dawning horror. "Dr. Matthews," Amelia whispered. "He was Mr. Worthington's private physician for 30 years, Mrs. Gable confirmed. I don't think Mrs. Worthington was the one who couldn't have children. I think it was him." The revelation was catastrophic. This wasn't just Eleanor's lie. It was a conspiracy. She hadn't deceived her husband. She had procured a son for him. She had saved him from the perceived shame of his infertility, from the failure to produce a blood heir for his empire. In doing so, she had made him complicit in the lie and bound him to her forever. Her secret wasn't her weakness. It was the source of all her power over him. Ethan now understood the fortress wasn't just built of lies. It was mortared with his father's silent, desperate shame. And Amelia hadn't just challenged a mother's claim. She had threatened the very foundation of the Worthington dynasty. Armed with Mrs. Gable's testimony, the nature of the conflict shifted. It was no longer just Amelia's word against Eleanor's. It was a siege, and Ethan was leading the charge against the fortress he had once called home. He returned to the penthouse that evening, a changed man. The boyish confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He found his parents in the living room, a fragile truce hanging in the air. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice devoid of warmth. Richard lowered his newspaper, sensing the shift in his son. Eleanor immediately went on the offensive. "Ethan, darling, we were just discussing the gala on Saturday. I found the most perfect tuxedo for you." "I spent the afternoon with a woman named Agnes Gable," Ethan cut in, silencing her. Eleanor's face went pale. Richard's expression darkened. "The thief!" Eleanor spat. "What lies has that bitter old woman been feeding you? She told me about the night I came home." Ethan continued, his voice steady as he advanced into the room. "In a basket through the service entrance, while my father was conveniently in Hong Kong. She told me how you never showed any signs of giving birth." "These are the ravings of a disgruntled servant," Eleanor cried, looking to Richard for support. "Richard, tell him." Richard stood up, his posture rigid. "Ethan, this has gone far enough. You are allowing these bottom feeders to poison your mind against your own mother." "Is she my mother?" Ethan challenged, his voice rising. "Or is she just the woman who bought me?" The accusation landed like a physical blow. Richard flinched. "And you?" Ethan said, turning his cold gaze on his father. "You knew. You've known all along. This wasn't her lie, was it? It was our lie." "You know what Dr. Matthews said?" "She told you. What did he say?" "Dad? Did he tell you that the great Richard Worthington couldn't produce an heir?" The color drained from Richard's face. The mention of Dr. Matthews was a direct hit, a cannonball blasting through the main gate of the fortress. He stared at his son, speechless, the carefully constructed facade of the powerful patriarch crumbling to dust. Eleanor saw she was losing, and her desperation turned to pure venom. She turned on Ethan. "You ungrateful little whelp! We gave you everything. A world of privilege you couldn't have dreamed of. That waitress would have raised you in a slum. We gave you love. We gave you this life, and this is how you repay us. By siding with some piece of trailer trash who abandoned you for cash." "She didn't abandon me," Ethan roared, his control finally snapping. "She was a child. You preyed on her. You stole her baby because you were so terrified of being replaced, of being the barren wife of a billionaire. And you, he said, whirling back to Richard, you let her do it. You hid behind her crime to protect your own fragile ego. The room crackled with the raw, ugly truth. Everything was out in the open. The secret festering at the heart of their family finally lanced. Richard Worthington, a man who commanded boardrooms and bent cities to his will, sank into a chair, looking old and defeated. It was a different time, he stammered, his voice raspy. My father, the legacy. I needed a son. You needed a lie. Ethan corrected him, his voice laced with contempt. The fight was over. The fortress had fallen. Eleanor stood amidst the ruins, her face a mask of hate. She looked at Ethan, not as a son, but as a traitor. Get out! She hissed, her voice shaking with rage. If you believe her, then go to her. But don't you dare come back here. You are no longer my son. I don't think I ever was, Ethan said quietly. He turned and walked out of the opulent living room, out of the penthouse, out of the life that had been so meticulously crafted for him. He didn't look back. As the elevator doors slid shut, he felt a profound sense of loss, but also for the first time, a glimmer of freedom. He was no longer Ethan Worthington the heir. He was just Ethan, and he had to figure out what that meant. His first call was to Amelia. It's over, he said, his voice heavy. They admitted it. He could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. There was a pause, and then her voice, soft and full, of a gentle strength he was beginning to recognize. Where are you? I don't know, he confessed, stepping out onto the bustling Manhattan street, feeling utterly alone. Come to my place, she said without hesitation. Come home. The weeks that followed were a quiet, painful, and transformative reconstruction. Ethan moved into Amelia's tiny one-bedroom apartment. He slept on the lumpy pull-out sofa in her living room, a world away from his custom-made mattress overlooking Central Park. He learned the rhythm of a life dictated not by social calendars, but by paychecks. He watched Amelia get ready for her new job at a bustling diner, a job she'd found with a quiet determination that awed him. She never complained. She never expressed bitterness towards the Worthingtons. Her focus was entirely on the present, on the miraculous, terrifying gift of having her son back in her life. It was awkward at first. They were strangers, bound by blood, but separated by a lifetime of different experiences. They navigated the space around each other with a delicate choreography of uncertainty. He learned she liked her coffee black, that she hummed off-key when she watered her plants, and that she had a fierce, dry wit that only came out when she felt comfortable. She learned he was not the spoiled princeling she'd imagined, but a thoughtful, wounded young man with a deep well of kindness. He saw the locket not on her neck, but on her small bedside table, placed like a sacred relic. One evening he picked it up. You kept this all this time. It was all I had of you, she said simply. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Richard Worthington, once he recovered from the initial shock, did what he did best: damage control. His lawyers reached out not with threats, but with an offer. A settlement. A massive one. A trust fund for Amelia that would ensure she never had to work again, and a separate, staggering inheritance for Ethan, accessible immediately. Ethan and Amelia discussed it in her small kitchen, the legal documents spread across the table. I don't want his money. Ethan said the words tasting like ash. Amelia looked at him, her expression serious. It's not his money, Ethan. It's your birthright. He owes you more than this. But this is a start. Don't let pride stop you from taking what you are owed. Use it. Do something good with it. Don't let their lie have the final say. On her advice, they accepted. But Ethan added a condition of his own. He insisted on a formal public acknowledgement. He didn't want the truth buried again under a mountain of money. The result was a sterile, carefully worded press release issued by Worthington Corp., announcing that Richard Worthington had recently connected with his biological son Ethan Hayes and was joyfully welcoming him into the family. It mentioned a private family matter and requested privacy. There was no mention of Eleanor. The society pages buzzed for a week, then moved on. Eleanor disappeared from public view. Ethan heard, through one of his father's assistants, that she had moved to their estate in Switzerland, refusing all contact. The great partnership, the foundation of the Worthington Empire, was irrevocably broken. Richard remained in New York, a lonely king in his Fifth Avenue castle. He called Ethan twice. The conversations were stilted, full of a vast, unspoken grief. A chasm of lies separated them that might never be bridged. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 3 months after the confrontation at Le Ciel Étoilé, Ethan and Amelia were walking through Central Park. He had used a portion of the settlement to set up a foundation to provide legal aid to young, vulnerable mothers, a project Amelia was helping him run. He had also legally changed his last name to Hayes. They bought hot dogs from a street vendor and sat on a bench overlooking the pond. For a long time they were quiet, comfortable in the silence they had built together. "Do you ever hate her?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Eleanor?" Amelia took a slow bite of her hot dog, considering the question. "I used to," she admitted. "For years I hated her with everything I had. But now I just see a woman who was so terrified of being nothing that she would do anything to be something. I don't hate her. I pity her." She looked at Ethan, a soft smile on her face. "And in a way, I have to thank her. She kept you safe. She gave you an education. She made you into the man you are." Ethan looked at his mother, his real mother. He saw the strength that had allowed her to survive 22 years of heartache, the grace that allowed her to forgive, the love that had burned like a hidden ember all that time. He had lost a life of unimaginable luxury, but he had gained something infinitely more valuable, the truth. He had found his foundation. "She didn't make me who I am," Ethan said, reaching over and taking her hand. Their fingers interlaced a natural, easy connection that had once seemed impossible. "You did. You just didn't know it." The story of Ethan and Amelia is a powerful reminder that truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always fight its way to the surface. It's a story about the devastating consequences of lies, but also about the incredible resilience of love. We see two kinds of mothers, one who tried to possess a son through wealth and control, and one whose love endured through absence, poverty, and time. Ethan's journey forces us to ask profound questions. What truly defines a family? Is it blood, or is it the life we share? Can forgiveness ever fully mend a betrayal so deep? This story shows that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or status. It's knowing who you are and where you come from. If this story of struggle, truth, and the enduring power of a mother's love moved you, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful real-life drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.